Lots of protests are ineffective because of something called cargo cult thinking. But to understand that, we need to go back to World War II in the Pacific. Now, there's some flaws with this story, which I will cover later. So the story goes that during World War II, Melanesian people all of a sudden were surrounded by all these outsiders, Americans building an airstrip on an isolated island, and subsequently there was all this military activity. And the indigenous people saw what was happening and could see that the Americans, other Europeans, were bringing in all this amazing technology and food, stuff that they termed cargo. But after the war, the military pulled out, and Melanesian people formed these new religious movements where they basically acted out what was happening on military bases to try and bring cargo in. So things like acting like you were using the radio to call planes in, clearing land for the airstrip, raising a flag and marching around in formation. But of course the cargo never came because they were just doing these things kind of ritualistically without understanding the actual mechanics, cause and effect. Anthropologists called this a cargo cult. Now, later research has shown that a lot of these initial reports were exaggerated and, well, a bit racist. I know, racist anthropology, what a shock. Melanesian people are not stupid, and anthropologists from the West were gathering unrelated religious practices, and some of them had roots in indigenous culture long before Europeans ever showed up. So, as it applies to Pacific Islanders, cargo cult as a concept is bunk. But the broader concept of cargo cult thinking is still useful, in this case for how we design protests. A lot of protests these days imitate the symbols and rituals of older, more effective protests without understanding what actually makes that stuff work. The reason that revolutionaries, striking workers, suffragettes would all gather in one place as a big group would be to actually do something. Take over a government building or hold a hard picket, stop people getting into a workplace so you can enforce your demands. Even if you're not actually taking direct action, the point is to present a credible threat that you will. I've been to so many protests where people gather in a public square, don't inconvenience anybody, and then give some speeches to the converted before everyone goes home. That is not effective political action. It's just a boring party. Of course, there's some value to building community and having a good time, but if your protest ends there, it's useless. Governments love when we protest this way. So it's not entirely activists' fault when they do this, they're being driven to do so by the police. Things like permit systems, there's a new wave of anti-protest laws, and of course police will violently attack effective protests. So when you're planning an action, make sure it's about more than just expressing yourself. Think about the causal link between your protest and the outcome that you want. How is what you're doing going to lead the government or a company to do what you want? Ditch the cargo cult thinking and let's think a bit more critically about how our protests are going to achieve change.